And hello and welcome to the Metropolitan Virtual Playhouse. I'm Alex Rowe, the inaudible artistic director of the theater. I'm very pleased you could join us for this event. This discussion, Theater and War with Robert L. Mclaughlin and Sally E. Parry, is a complement to the Metropolitan Virtual Playhouse reading of John Steinbeck's The Moon is Down, playing now on Broadway On Demand through midnight Eastern Time, tomorrow, Sunday, April 24th, 2022. This reading was organized to raise funds to support direct relief in their admirable work in Ukraine and the region, bringing medical supplies, organizing logistics, and helping ease some of the suffering in that dreadful, dreadful circumstance now upon us. Thank you to those who have already watched the reading of The Moon is Down. Thank you to those who have already made contributions. We are near to $2,000. We hope to raise many more. And your generosity is making a great deal of difference. It's greatly appreciated both by Metropolitan, by Direct Relief, and we trust by those that Direct Relief is able to aid in Europe now. About tonight's event, I am often assumed to be widely read and well-informed, as I have had the chance to produce so many compelling but overlooked and sometimes even obscure plays at Metropolitan Playhouse. Those who know me know this is simply not true. It's all dumb luck, sometimes serendipity, and most always good friends. I had never known of John Steinbeck's career as a playwright at all. I have seen the adaptation of Mice and Men on stage, but I certainly didn't know that Steinbeck had written a play about war, inspired, many say, by the Nazi occupation of Norway in 1940. His novella, The Moon is Down, then turned into a play within a few months, is discussed in Bob Mclaughlin and Sally Parry's informative, witty, and inspiring book, Broadway Goes to War, generally about America's theatrical response to World War II and published just last year in 2021. They sent me a copy, and I was thrilled to discover so many interesting plays in it. In it, they draw attention to many excellent plays of the era, some of which are very well known, some less. And one of the ones that grabbed me most strongly was The Moon is Down. I envisioned a production of it sometime in the future. Current events mandated a reading of it to raise some funds much sooner than I'd ever anticipated. I'm delighted they can join us now to expand on the themes of their fascinating book. Before I welcome them to the stage, though, let me advise those of you who are not familiar with the webinar format. There is a Q&A function. You can ask questions in the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen, and we will answer them as best we can. You can also chat with us using the chat function. And those of you who would like to be, we can elevate to panelists, which means you can join us here on the screen, either with video and audio or just with audio, to ask questions or engage in a discussion with us as if we are all in the same Zoom. If you are watching on YouTube, your comments are welcome as well, although they are 20 seconds delayed from the action here. We will answer them as best we can. So without further ado, I look very much forward to the conversation about to ensue with Bob Mclaughlin and Sally Parry. Welcome, Bob and Sally.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're delighted to be here.
We are indeed. And if you haven't seen the Moon is Down yet, we watched it this afternoon, and it is well worth watching. Very
yes.
well done production.
Yes, indeed.
Right. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in World War II, about how popular culture worked during World War II, and especially about how plays that were done in New York mostly during the war functioned or functioned differently, let's say, than a lot of other popular culture. And then we will be talking a little bit about The Moon is Down, and we look forward to your questions and comments and disagreements or whatever. Do you want us, Alex, to turn off our video now?
It is entirely up to you. I'm at your service. I'm going to turn mine off. And when you want to start showing the slides, if that's this moment, we'll start it then.
All right.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to replace myself. I'm delighted to do it with the first image.
Excellent, thank you. Well, so what's happening in World War II on April 7th, 1942, the night that Moon is Down opens on Broadway? It's exactly 4 months since the attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States' entry into the war.
Okay, and it's next slide, please. Okay, here are some of the countries that have been invaded by April 1942, including those that Germany has invaded: Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and so forth. Italy has invaded parts of North Africa and Greece, and Japan has taken over much of the Far East. Next slide. Okay, so just 2 years since Germany's invasion and occupation of Denmark and Norway, and almost 2 years since its invasion of Belgium and France.
A Red Army counteroffensive continues to push back German troops attempting to capture Moscow.
Next slide. Japanese troops pile up victories in the Pacific, occupying Singapore and invading Burma and the Solomon Islands. The Philippines will fall just days after the Moon is Down opens.
12 days after the Moon is Down opens, the Doolittle raid, in which land-based bombers took off from aircraft carriers and bombed several Japanese cities, will take place. The raid caused little damage, but was a boost in American morale.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, I like this image because it's some children trying to look at the globe, trying to figure out what's going on. And that's part of the point of theater and movies at the time. No slides are being seen.
Hold on for a moment, Bob and Sally. We're getting messages. They show up very clearly on our webinar screen. So can those of you who are watching let us know what you are seeing?
Oh, somebody else says they see them.
I see what's happening. We might want to review again. Auditors, let me just take over again. I presume that you are seeing me now. If you have your view set not to gallery mode, but to speaker mode, you will not see the slides, I believe. That may be the issue. I'm not sure. Apparently, people can see them now. It's hard to say. Please do chat. If you can see me, I'm going to go to the first slide again. Okay. And I trust you can see it at this moment. If anyone watching the chat could, okay. Most people are chatting that they can see them.
Okay, oh, Ayla's here.
So what I will suggest you do if you're watching on Zoom and this instruction makes sense to you, either have your view in gallery mode or even go so far as to select my screen, which is the one that should be showing now as I speak, and pin it. If you pin my screen, it will allow the slides to be prominent until such time as Sally and Bob come back, at which point you might want to unpin it. So I hope we've worked that out. Do keep us apprised. I see most people are seeing them and they're able to see them on YouTube. Sally and Bob, would you like to go back and just cover these again?
Sure. Okay. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that we want to talk about is the time period in which the Moon is Down opens on Broadway. And so as you can see from that slide, by April 1942, the Germans had invaded a number of countries in Europe. Italy had invaded parts of Greece, North Africa, and so forth, and Japan had invaded much of the Far East. And so one of the things that we want to talk about is the totality of what's going on here. So if you go to the next slide, basically this is a demonstration. All this blue is where the Germans have made inroads. So about 2 years, Moon is Down opens about 2 years since Germany's invasion and occupation of Denmark and Norway, and almost 2 years since the invasion of Belgium and France.
As you can see, both in Europe, well, Germany seems to be having pretty much of its way, except they're having some problems on the Eastern Front with the Soviets. But otherwise, things are going pretty well for them. And if we look at the next slide and we look at the Pacific, Japan, after its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, quickly gained territory throughout the South Pacific. In Indochina, they've invaded Burma, they've invaded the Solomon Islands by this point. So again, things aren't looking very good right now.
Go into the Doolittle read.
Okay, and in April 1942, we had the Doolittle raid, which was really America's first chance to hit back at the Japanese. And again, as I said, it didn't cause a lot of damage. But it caused a lot of concern among the Japanese leadership. They didn't think that they could be struck directly by the United States. And to see U.S. bombers flying overhead and dropping bombs, that caused a lot of trouble for them. So it was an important moment.
Okay, we wanted to show what was going on with the Axis versus the Allies, and we're making it sound as though everybody understood. And the answer was actually no, they didn't. There was a lot of confusion about what was going on. If you think back, if you were alive in the time, you had lots of questions. Some of the questions were, how long will this war last? I mean, there were people who said it'd be over by Christmas, and they said that for a number of years. So that didn't really work very well. One of the things, another was who would win. Until we get kind of late into 1943, it's not clear who's going to win and who's going to control the territory that's being contested. And then finally, and this is a major question, what in heaven's name are we doing in these places? We don't know where they are. We can't pronounce them. Why are we sending our armed services overseas to fight things that we don't understand and that we don't know about? One of the things to think about, and if you go to the next slide, the slide after this, is the myth of pulling together. I think that everybody has heard, and it's been repeated in history books, it's been repeated in lots of popular culture, that there was a myth of pulling together. The narrative that after Pearl Harbor, Americans put aside their disagreements and differences, and they joined together to fight the war. And a lot of people these days say, if it was only like during World War II, where everybody kind of felt the same way and they had similar purposes. Unfortunately, it's really a myth. There's a lot of popular culture that represents this idea of pulling together and that we all think alike. But truth be told, the pulling together myth is really just that. I mean, there were people who felt very strongly about the war, but there were a lot of people who were not sure we should be sending people overseas, that we should be fighting for Europeans at all.
African Americans felt, why should we be defending freedom overseas when we don't have freedom at home?
Yeah.
So opinion polls of the time showed the extent to which Americans were far from all in regarding the war. One historian reports, quote, in the first months after Pearl Harbor, it seemed obvious that the United States was fighting in self-defense. But by the middle of 1942, public opinion analyst Jerome Bruner found that significant numbers of people were not as sure why they were involved. In July 1942, 30% of those responding to the question, do you feel you have a clear idea of what this war is all about? That is, what we are fighting for, answered negatively. While in December, the number had risen to 35%. Other polls in the fall of 1942 showed that approximately a third of the people interviewed were willing to accept a separate peace with Germany. And even after the announcement of the policy of unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference in early 1943, the percentage remained almost as high. Other surveys too indicated significant public mistrust of America's allies.
If you go back one slide, Alex. So we'd like to talk a little bit about propaganda and popular culture in World War II, because one of the things that people think about is, or they often dismiss a lot of fiction, theater, and so forth during the World War II era, as just propaganda. And it's so much more complicated than that. One of the things that popular culture, and we're talking about a number of types of popular culture, is that they provided narratives for the public to understand the war, where these places were that our soldiers were going to, what in heaven's name they were doing. And when you think about propaganda, it's not just about emotions. I mean, emotions are a very easy way to grab somebody, as we're all aware of with, incendiary rhetoric and so forth. But propaganda, seen more clearly, is a coordinated campaign to change the way that people think. And that's really, really important. Now, if you'll go ahead 2 slides. There, perfect. Okay. During World War II, there were a variety of popular culture media, and some of them are on the slide here: movies, radios, songs, journalism, cartoons, posters, and so forth, that were sources of some of these fundamental narratives, which Americans heard over and over again. And these narratives were important because they taught audiences why we had to win the war, why we had to fight the war, why we had to defeat our enemies, why we had to support our allies, and what each American man, woman, and child had to do to support the war effort. And these narratives, with repetition and over time, became for many people the truth of the war.
And that's one of the reasons that today we still have this, the pulling together myth that Sally talked about a few minutes ago. Popular culture during the war was so successful that it made us, it created its own history, if you will, that people now think that it was this golden time of everybody being on the same page. But what we found in our research when we turned our attention to the theater is that the theater operated quite differently from other popular culture media during the war, in that there was a variety of positions and attitudes and narratives about the war, America and Americans presented on stage.
Okay, could you go to the next slide? Yeah.
There are several reasons for this. Theater in the 1930s was much more politically engaged than other popular culture media. The first film that was openly critical of Nazi Germany was Confessions of a Nazi Spy, which was released by Warner Brothers in 1939. The first Broadway play that was critical of Nazi Germany was a play called Culture, and it opened September 26, 1933, 9 months after Hitler came to power. The theater was engaging with the world situation much more quickly than the movies were. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One is that going into the 30s, the theater was very influenced by the labor play, labor unions putting on shows of various kinds that were supposed to encourage people to support unions, to join unions. There were a number of theater companies, the Theater Guild and the Group Theater, that tended to be more or less politically oriented, and were presenting plays that wanted to deal with the world situation. There were a lot of playwrights who would do their political work for a film script or for play scripts to be produced on Broadway. Then they would go to Hollywood and make money doing something that was apolitical. So by the time before the war started, before the United States entered the war, there were a lot of plays like It Can't Happen Here, Bury the Dead, that expressed the variety or the range of opinions about the war that Americans actually held. There were plays that were very idealistically pacifistic. There were plays that were kind of cynically pacifistic. There were plays that were extremely critical of fascism and arguing that we had to find some way to engage and defeat fascism. There were plays like It Can't Happen Here that showed the dangers of fascism in the United States. There were plays that showed to various degrees the extent to which we ought to support our allies, especially Great Britain. And none of these positions were necessarily very popular with the public until Pearl Harbor, when all of a sudden, most American pop culture got on the same page in terms of telling the official narratives about the war that Sally was talking about, and encouraging all Americans to act as they need to do for us to win the war. However, even after Pearl Harbor, the theater tended to be more, what would the word be? More critical?
Yes.
Not always. There were flag waving plays like Irving Berlin's This Is the Army and Moss Hart's Winged Victory. But there were also plays that showed where the ideals America was fighting for fell short at home. There were plays that celebrated our allies and criticized our enemies, but there were also plays like The Moon is Down that presented our enemies as human beings like us. There were plays like the popular comedy Janie that laughed at the foibles of young people, but there were also plays like Pickup Girl that exposed social problems and juvenile delinquency. In short, the theater of World War II offers a more complete picture of the complexity of life during the war years than any other popular cultural medium.
Okay, next slide. One of the transitional pieces is Watch on the Rhine, Lillian Hillman's play that came out in 1941. And it's important because this is before Pearl Harbor, but it drew attention to the fact that Americans had to pay attention, that they couldn't just stay in the United States and assume things would happen elsewhere and it wouldn't affect them at all. This is really one of the first plays that is drawing Americans in and saying, yes, you have to be part of this. You just can't sit by the sidelines. And that's where John Steinbeck comes in. So next slide for John Steinbeck. We're now going to talk a little bit about Steinbeck and The Moon is Down. And let me give you just a little bit of background on Steinbeck himself. I guess the Steinbeck slide should be in there. There's a picture of Alex. There's a pic. There should. Oh, okay. Okay. Go back to the other one is better.
I'll take a look for it.
Okay. Well, if you go back to that one will work. John Steinbeck, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was a best-selling author from the 1930s through the early 1960s. He won the Pulitzer Prize for The Grapes of Wrath. He won the Nobel Prize in 1962. He wrote 33 books. Presidential Medal of Freedom. I mean, he's a very decorated author. And he's known I'm using these book covers as kind of an example of some of the things that he was most known for. He wrote a lot of populist novels that were concerned with the people, the ordinary people. And if you've watched The Moon is Down or you're about to, you'll notice over and over again that the people as a group, but as a thinking group of people, is something that he concentrates on over and over. So, you know, when you think about his writing, especially in the California novels, like Tortilla Flat, Of Mice and Men, and Grapes of Wrath, one of the things he's really interested in is how do workers survive in an atmosphere that is not always very welcoming and very friendly. So Grapes of Wrath, as many of you know, either through the novel or through the movie with Henry Fonda, is about a group of Okies that go to California, kind of as a promised land. And for Steinbeck, California in many ways is sort of Edenic. But on the other hand, it's also, how do people who have almost nothing survive? And the survival is so very important. In Dubious Battle, another one of his novels from the 1930s, he deals with fruit pickers who are trying desperately to make a living and stay healthy while doing very backbreaking work. He would continue to write about the workers, about the ordinary people from a populist perspective, all the way through East of Eden. But so that's just kind of the overview of his writing and his thinking about people. The other one that some people may know is Travels with Charlie in Search of America. Now it's different from all of the others. It doesn't take place in California, although what Steinbeck does is, and we're in the Vietnam era here, is he travels around the country with Charlie, his dog, and that's a picture of the dog. And he's trying to find out what America is like these days in the early 1960s. A lot of what he finds is not very pretty. I think that many of us thought, well, World War II was going to end a lot of things. It was going to end fascism. It was going to end racism. It was going to end sort of endemic poverty. And none of that happened. So Steinbeck is in some ways disillusioned, and what he's trying to do in Travels with Charlie, which is a really lovely kind of memoir, is talk to ordinary Americans and find out what they think about life, about the world, and how they're dealing with it. It's sort of a wonderful insight into Steinbeck's thinking. But now on to The Moon is Down. I want to talk about.
Yeah, the Steinbeck was very eager to participate in the war effort. He was called to Washington by the Foreign Information Service, which eventually became part of the Office of War Information. And its job was to try to send messages about the, how wonderful the United States is to other countries. Its most famous operation was the Voice of America radio broadcast. And so during the middle of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, he's already being called to Washington to see what he can do to help, prepare for, the United States' possible participation in the war. The meetings with the Foreign Information Service, the FIS, don't really result in much of anything right away, but he's inspired to write a book about the war. He wants to write a book about the resiliency of occupied people. His initial idea is that it's going to be set in the United States. What would happen if a small American town was occupied by a foreign invader? But he ended up on advice of some people who didn't think that was a very good idea to set it elsewhere. But he actually finished the first draft of The Moon is Down on December 7th, 1941. So as the United States entered the war, he had this manuscript ready. After we entered the war, he was kind of, I'm not sure what the word, loose ends, that the Foreign Information Service and other, the Army, for example, and the Navy and his draft board were concerned about his security checks because he was considered a leftist, and they weren't sure to what extent he was trustworthy. He was always being interviewed being investigated by the FBI. He ended up meeting with Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, who recruited him to research the training for a bomber crew, which ended up being a book that he published 43 called Bombs Away. That's an exciting title. And which was, fairly accessible. It was kind of a picture book, a lot of photographs in his text. But then there was kind of a tug of war between the Air Force that wanted to keep writing for the Air Force, and then the Monterey Draft Board, which couldn't imagine, they thought he was such a trashy writer that he couldn't possibly be doing anything of any value for the war effort. And so they just wanted to recruit him as a private. It went on for some time. The other thing he was doing during this time period was once a week, he was writing a radio script for the FIS that was being broadcast overseas. So a lot of his efforts were indeed going toward the war effort as the war went on.
One of the things to think about too is his technique. I mean, if you all read Grapes of Wrath, maybe in high school or in college or something, it's a pretty thick book, and it's compelling, but it's quite long. One of the other techniques, though, that Steinbeck was trying out in the late 1930s and early 1940s was thinking about novels and plays as kind of coexisting. So if one reads, for example, the novel of The Moon is Down, it's only about 170 pages. That, like Of Mice and Men, were he thought of them as first fiction, but the fiction is really primarily dialogue. And then one was able to take the fiction and turn it into a play without a lot of changes. So, in looking at the difference between, say, the novel and the play of The Moon is Down, there's very little difference. And one of the reasons for that is that it's kind of like dialogue with stage directions fit in. Of Mice and Men, which came out a couple of years earlier, was very successful both as a novel and as a play. But when Steinbeck moved to The Moon is Down, although, as Alex mentioned early on, most people read it as the Nazis invading Norway. And Norway was important because, so the novel and the plays don't name the countries, but Norway, for many Americans, sort of stood in for America in the sense that Norway actually put up much more resistance to the Nazis, say, than a country like France or Belgium or the Netherlands or so forth.
Norway didn't, never really officially surrendered. And so in that sense, they ended up being kind of a symbol for the United States of the country that refused to give in to the occupiers. The novel of The Moon is Down was published the month before it opened on Broadway. So it was in March 1942. And it was a big bestseller. It sold almost as well as The Grapes of Wrath. The downside was that it was not critically well received at all. And it certainly isn't any Grapes of Wrath. But it's there's some of the attacks on it were quite vicious. Clifton Fadiman in the New Yorker and James Thurber in the New Republic both wrote lengthy articles, in fact, more than one, attacking it for treating the invaders, the quote Germans, much too lightly. That it captured nothing of the brutality of a German occupation, that it made them look too sympathetic even. And this ended up being a major critical point. James Thurber went so far as to call the novel, it could have been called War in Wonderland because it made it look so nice. So that, and these criticisms really got to Steinbeck. He thought they missed the point of the novel. He resented them. He was kind of thin-skinned, so he would have, probably any criticism would have upset him. But yeah,
that's true. Next slide. Well, anyway, so the play opens on April 7th, but it only runs 71 performances. Here you see this is the playbill. Ralph Morgan, who was an actor both in Hollywood and on Broadway for a long time, played Mayor Orden, and Otto Kruger played Colonel Lancer. The reviews were not all that hot. But one of the things that I would like to talk about just a bit before I talk about the actual reviews themselves is what's important to think about when we're talking about the portrayal of war in novels, in theater, even in movies. And one of the points that was made in the Book of the Month Club insert that Dorothy Canfield Fisher, the novelist, wrote about The Moon is Down is the difference between how journalism portrays war. And it can be very violent. It shows a lot. It gives a lot of detail, often very graphic pictures and so forth. But as she says, journalists, many of them observe clearly, reported well, and yet how pale and lifeless, how oddly unreal the best of their articles about the real facts seem, compared with good fiction, not written about any particular or certified as having happened incidents, but about human reality. Steinbeck, with his first scene, transports you heart and soul and body into the plain little rural Norwegian town, or Belgium, or Dutch, or Czech, for the story could happen anywhere in any civilized country inhabited by free men and women. You stand there in a country home, slightly stuffy, slightly shabby, infinitely clean, comfortable and self-respecting, waiting for the invaders to come in and tell you how to run your life. And you realize that never once until then have you really understood what those facts humanly mean, which you have so conscientiously garnered out of accurate, informative books of personal reminiscences. A fiction writer with a truly creative imagination who sets some living, various complex human beings before you, interprets the news without a commenting word of explanation or exposition, so that it becomes something actual, as if out of your own experience, not just a record of fact. And I think that Dorothy Canfield Fisher was really spot on in talking about how movies and plays and novels bring something like that to life. Now, having said that, if we go to the next slide, we can see some of the responses from the critics. New York in the 1940s had a lot of newspapers, and so there were a lot of critics who who commented on plays. And I've looked at all the reviews, and although Brooks Atkinson in the New York Times gave it a terrific review, calm and reasonable story about the immortality of freedom in terms of a tiny village, None of the other reviews by any of the major critics were better than mixed. Some of them were mixed to tremendously negative. John Anderson in the Journal of American said it was pretentious. John Mason Brown in the New York World Telegram said it was dull. So anyway, it ran, as I said, ran 71 performances, which is basically just a couple of months. And one of the things to think about is that it becomes, how does it speak to its audience?
Okay. One of the things that we think about the play is that the whole criticism of the invaders being presented as too human is the point, is that the play it very subtly shows basically how easy it would be to collaborate, to cooperate. Colonel Lansing is a reasonable man. In some ways, he's a very charming man. It would really be a lot easier just to go along with him. You say, well, yeah, it would. That's not that big a deal. You can stay in this house. Yes, we can do the things you want us to do. But the country people, the townspeople, refuse to do that. They know they're making life harder on themselves by refusing to go along, by refusing to take the easy way, but they do it anyway as a form of their resistance. Connected to that is in so doing, they end up denying the invaders their humanity. They're people, they miss their homes. They're thinking, well, this is a pretty part of the world. This would be a nice place to buy a house and have a little farm. The people here are so nice. But they're lonely. They're far away from home. They're homesick. They want company. They want to be treated nicely. And the townspeople refuse to do it. They refuse to give them their humanity. They treat them like invaders. They treat them like others. They treat them as the brutes that they perceive them to be. At one point the mayor talks, well, what's all this nonsense about laws between us? You're either going to kill all of us, or we're going to kill all of you. And that attitude pervades the entire town. So to us, the power of the show comes from the way that it demonstrates how resistance can work, that it's hard, but it works as the invaders are kind of driven slowly stir crazy.
Mm-hmm. And at the very end of the play, the mayor says something about herdmen win battles, but freemen win wars. And for Steinbeck, the idea that individuals operate in sort of a phalanx, which is basically individually critically thinking people who work together to accomplish something, as opposed to the herdmen, the Nazis, who take orders from above. They're always talking about, what do you hear from the capital? What do you hear from the leader? As though they can't think on their own. And so at times the colonel says, well, I know what they're going to say, and that's what we have to do, regardless of what we think. And that's really a problem, is that they aren't thinking, they're just acting based on sort of an autocratic order. Another thing to think about too is, because in the play, everything with the exception of the one scene in Molly Morden's house takes place in the mayor's house, there's a tremendous sense of claustrophobia. The mayor is there, his wife is there, their servants are there, the doctor is there, and there are the invaders. And there's no place to go, because the way the play is set up is the invaders surround them, and although they can move within the physical space of the stage, they can't get out. And that kind of represents metaphorically how the country as a whole feels, because these people, they live in this country. It is their country, and they don't all want to move out. They want to stay in the country, but they don't want the invaders to tell them what to do. Now, one of the things to think about, and if you'll go to the next slide, is how to turn it into a movie. And one of the things that often happens when a stage play becomes a movie is that it opens it up in many ways. And that's one of the things that happens the sense of claustrophobia changes, and it changes rather dramatically. In the movie, Norway is specifically identified as the country that is being fought over. In the movie, and it's a wonderful movie if you haven't seen it. It would give you a different perspective on the play. Henry Travers plays the mayor, and some of you may remember him as Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life. Lee J. Cobb is Dr. Winter, and Cedric Hardwicke is Colonel Lancers. So he comes out of the tradition of educated Germans who sound like us, like the Allies, but are inhabiting a very different sort of ideology. The other thing to notice too is in the portrayal of the town, the town is actually on the set of what was the movie of How Green Was My Valley. So we do have a very detailed set for it. And we see a lot of opening up, and in some ways it's good because rather than having the explosions take place off stage, the bombings, the executions and whatnot, we actually see them on the screen, and seeing something and hearing something are very different for a person.
That's right. One of the things that some of the reviewers of the play said was that everything exciting happens off stage, which, as we said, it seems to be part of the point. But in the movie, you get to see a lot of those things. We see the paratroopers coming down at the beginning. We see Corel take the troops out for a picnic and drill. And then we see the troops getting mowed down by the machine guns when they're betrayed at the beginning. We just hear about all of that in the play. But there are a couple of other interesting additions. When Nunnally Johnson, the screenwriter, contacted Steinbeck about what he should do with the screenplay, Steinbeck told him, tamper with it all you want. And he added some interesting things. There's a scene where one of the German soldiers is keeping track of a bunch of people on a bread line. And he tries to talk to a little girl who reminds him of his own daughter far away at home. And the little girl is scared of him. And he starts blowing and blasting at the people in the crowd that, look at you all, you're all frowning, you should smile at Germans and blah, 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 blah. And then he's caught short. He stops because the camera goes down the line and everybody in the line has these really eerie, mirthless smiles, right? It's really creepy. There's another scene where Lieutenant Tonder, the one who ends up getting killed by Molly Morden, he goes into a pub, and as soon as he goes in, everybody stands up to leave. And he orders them to sit down. And he says, some places where the Germans have been, we've had to create a rule where people can't leave a restaurant or a public place for 15 minutes until after a German officer enters. But perhaps we can be more human here. We can enjoy each other's company. We're going to be here for a long time, so we may as well get used to one another. So won't you all please sit down and finish your drinks and blah, blah, blah. And one of the townspeople looks at him and says, 15 minutes, Lieutenant, takes out his watch, puts it on the table. Everybody's quiet for 15 minutes, then gets up and leaves. Once again, they did another example of them denying the humanity. One of the things, I'm not sure whether Sally and I disagree about this or not, but one of the things that I think they mess up in the movie is that after Lieutenant Prackle who gets shot?
Yeah.
There's a long scene where some hostages are taken and executed, and it's very moving, but it's right in the middle of the film. And considering that Colonel Lancer's goal is not to have to do that, and that the kind of the dramatic thrust of the play comes when he's finally forced to do it, even though it's not going to work, it kind of messes up the dramatic structure to put this very effective execution scene right in the middle of the film. In fact, when we were talking about this earlier today, getting ready for the presentation, Sally was thinking that was the climax of the movie that they...
I had forgotten. Now, if you go to the next slide, this is Henry Travers and Lee J. Cobb, and this is how they are at the very end of the movie as they're being sent out to be executed. And it's they're very determined about it and kind of resigned. But one of the things that's important to remember about Steinbeck's writing is the whole idea of the people, and the people are those who are responsible for their fate. There isn't one leader. So if the mayor gets killed, if the doctor gets killed, there are other people to take their place because they aren't reliant on, they're reliant on one another rather than just on one autocratic leader.
Mm.
So if you go to the last slide there, this is the invasion of the town, but the whole idea of the herdmen versus the freemen is something that resonates at the end. And I think that's how we'd like to leave our presentation, with this image, because whether we're talking Norway or more recent events in the Ukraine, the idea of invaders, of people disrupting a peaceful way of life in order to impose a certain kind of ideology and try and take power away from the free people is terrible. That's what they are.
And with that, I think we've talked long enough.
I think so.
But we're very happy to respond to comments or questions or criticisms or whatever.
Back to that.
I think so.
Well, let me invite you to bring your videos on. Yeah, thank you so much. And audience, the opportunity is now yours to either enter comments in the chat or use the Q&A function. And if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to write a comment there. We'll try to pick those up as well. It's so interesting to look at the film stills and reflect on the play as it was originally produced. And a couple things jumped out to me. I wondered if you see the same thing, or see these also as common in other works of the time or not. One of them is that the play, although it may have been seemed uneasy to some people for this reason, really shows the suffering of both sides, that no one involved in an action like this comes out unscathed, and that it is almost, the play would almost suggest, harder on the people we see more of, being the soldiers who are the invading army, translated out of their humanity into nothing but invaders, than it is on the populace. Any further development on that? I was so struck by it.
You know, I think that's true. That was a big criticism. Actually, when The Moon Is Down went on tour, the people playing the Nazis were toughened up quite a bit, because seeing, especially in the middle of a war, trying to see your enemy as human makes it harder to fight them, because you know, you could talk, and although they do unreasonable things, at least they seem to be human. Whereas if you're fighting, whether you're talking about the German or the Japanese or whatever, if you're successful in making them an other, it's lots easier to kill them.
It's not unusual in World War II movies to have good Germans, the kinds of Germans that we will have to work with to rebuild the country when the war is over. But the German military people and the German leadership are continually presented as practically inhuman in their cruelty and their disregard for human life and their willingness to betray each other. But this one, I think, is unusual in the sense that it's the Germans are presented as it's easy. We don't approve of them, but we can sympathize with them, and I think that's really important to the effectiveness of the play, that we do so.
Right.
It is one more way in which the unfortunate equivalence of the events of the time and the play's focus seem to bleed into the circumstances today, which is of course part of why we wanted to do it so soon. But this notion of the equivocal morality and acceptance of brothers. I mean, certainly in what we see in Ukraine, you do see people who are not just neighbors, but many sharing families and backgrounds over the war. It's as much a civil war in many ways. So this ability to see us as human or inhuman. I'm sorry, Sally, you're going to say.
Oh no, I was just going to say, in language too. I mean, I think that's one of the things in the Ukraine too, is that not only might they have families across the border, but many of them speak Russian. So there's less distinction. Whereas, you know, if you're talking about the Allies, say, versus the Germans, they speak different languages. I think in Ukraine, it becomes kind of muddled because of the shared language, and in many cases, much of the shared culture.
Though, as you and I were discussing earlier, the fact that the soldiers have not such foreign sounding names versus the townspeople, and the fact that that in many ways they sound like regular old American soldiers. Yeah, they're very much based on the GI image, it seems to me, that we have taken away from other films, at least at the time, complicating it all the more. Certainly one of the reasons we originally wanted to present the play before the events of Ukraine and Russia now was that it seems an indictment and question of occupations and not exactly colonialism, but foreign escapades on anyone's behalf, and not we don't come off ourselves as guiltless and victimized. There's another.
I was going to say it's also interesting that when we're talking about invaders, there was a play late 1930s, There Shall Be No Night by Robert E. Sherwood, and what was interesting about that is partway through the Broadway run, they changed who the bad guys were, the invaders were, because they were interested in changing. It was Finland and Russia, right?
The original play was Russia invading Finland. So the Russians were the bad invaders. Mm-hmm. And then once we entered the war, or once Germany invaded Soviet Union, it was actually at the request of President Roosevelt that he rewrote it to make it about the Germans invading Greece.
So it was invaders of one sort or another.
Well, we have a question about some of these reactions. A YouTube question comes in and asks, can we discuss the play's impact in Europe and European countries during World War II? I mean, in other words, what was the European reception, or how well was it known?
Well, that's really interesting, because that's one of the things that Steinbeck pointed to when people were criticizing it for not being realistic about an occupation. Reportedly it became one of the most popular underground pieces of literature in occupied countries. People in Norway, people in France, Denmark, and whatnot couldn't get enough of it. There were these copies that were passed around until they would fall apart. So to him, that showed that it spoke to the people in occupied countries and gave them hope. So he used that as evidence that what he was trying to do was successful.
Here's a question, another one about Steinbeck and his reputation in a way. From Ted, who is part of the webinar. Did the work change Steinbeck's image as an untrustworthy, in quotes, leftist? How did it affect his reputation, would you say, in terms of his politics?
Steinbeck's reputation kind of morphs over time. It's really interesting because he was perceived as a leftist with all of his labor writing in the 1930s. But he's a patriot, works for the war, and by the early 1960s, when we're in the Vietnam War, he's become very conservative. Mm-hmm. So his political alliances changed dramatically over time. I mean, I think during the height of the war, with the moon is down, with all of his work for the government, with the bombs away and whatnot, he was perceived very much as a patriot.
Yeah. There were some people like the big business interests in California who never forgave him for the Grapes of Wrath, the way they made the state look. And that was behind a lot of the FBI. I suspect the FBI was investigating him till the day he died.
Oh, probably.
But they investigated everybody, so.
A boy can dream, I suppose. Another, perhaps a tangential question about Steinbeck's your perception of his own perception. Do we know anything about his particular reaction to the comparatively short run of the play?
I don't think he was that surprised, because some of the criticism about the novel and the sort of nice Nazi, so to speak, he had already endured. And also, when he sold the movie rights, they were sold for an enormous amount of money.
$300,000. It set a record at the time for the largest movie sale ever.
And in some ways, since he was not just a theater person, being able to sell the property for that much money and also gain an enormous audience, because like during the war, 90 million people a week went to the movies. So in a sense, having the property sold to the movies gained a lot more people than would have seen it on Broadway. So I'm not sure he felt terrible about it.
Well, he knew that the reviews of the novel had kind of primed the critics in New York to pile on to the play as well. In fact, he didn't go to opening night. He was living in a house up the Hudson. He just stayed there with his, well, not his wife, his wife to be, and he had them call to tell him how it went. But I don't think he had high hopes for it.
No, and you know, it was interesting in looking at all of the reviewers. About half of them said, I read the book first so I could compare it to the movie or compare it to the play. And the other half said, I purposely did not read the novel so I could, you know, come at the play fresh.
While on the subject of the cinematization of both works, one person asks, tongue in cheek, but I'm curious myself, who's the dame? Who are the lovers as portrayed in the film poster, which seems very, very distant from the play?
That's Alex and Molly Morden. I don't remember the performers, do you?
I don't remember the performers. You know, interestingly, despite the fact that a lot of money was paid for the property of The Moon is Down, Cedric Hardwicke was like the biggest name, and Henry Travers usually did supporting parts. So there is more background on the Mordens before Alex gets executed. So we actually see a rather long sequence about the trial and so forth.
Right. And we see him, you know, in the town before the invasion takes place. It's they spice it up. But yeah, Sally's point is a good one. With the money that they paid for the movie rights, you would have thought that they would have made this a real A production with the 20th Century Fox's big stars, but they didn't.
This is where I apologize to the audience for all the spoilers if you have not yet watched the video. And I certainly hope you will. There's a lot that we're leaving out too, and wonderful performances by the actors in the Metropolitan reading. Here's a comment, and as I read this comment, I want to remind webinar participants that if you would like, you're welcome to join us either with audio or audio and video, and you may be perfectly happy not to, watching from the comforts of your home. But this comment, I think the power of the depiction of Lancer is that he's portrayed as a human, but still willing to perform brutal acts, even though he knows it won't work. That he wasn't just a rigid ideological Nazi, or that, forgive me, it was not just rigid ideological Nazis who were doing these things. And I think this from Gale Horn is very, very perceptive, that this portrayal of the moral compromise that anyone can suffer or embrace is far more compelling and chilling than if he were just a cold-hearted, evil Nazi figure.
Well, you know, there's actually a trope, especially in movies portraying German officers, of a German officer who often speaks beautiful English. George Saunders played them, Cedric Hardwicke. I mean, there are a number of them who seem superficially to be logical, to be civilized. And so why they would follow this ideology becomes kind of mysterious. And then once you peel away the superficial layer, you see the ideology underneath. But this was actually a very common trope at the time of the sort of educated German. Now, if you think about, say, the portrayal of Japanese officers during the war, there's only one movie we can think of that does that at all. In presentations of the Germans, it's a little bit more nuanced.
Well, I love Colonel Lancer's speech about remembering when he was in Belgium, and how the people seemed to love him, and then when they were retreating, they were being picked off one by one.
Mm-hmm.
And they found out the people had hated them all along. I think that's a very telling speech.
Mm-hmm.
That lets us know where he's coming from. That the people who give these orders, they don't know anything about war, and but I'm going to follow them anyway. I'm a soldier. It's a very interesting character.
In ways, it's interesting to see that attention to Lancer's humanity or personhood, really, the same thing, I suppose, seems consonant with other works that we may know better of Steinbeck's. His understanding of people's behavior and motivation, whatever their class of authority, might be. You know, he's the I always think of the empathy in Steinbeck's work as being the embrace of everyone's condition as extraordinary and telling. And in many of his works, we see people finding themselves in a position of making a moral choice or a stand, taking a stand, such as George at the end of Mice and Men, where the Joneses, they're moving across America and finding themselves in challenging, completely unexpected positions that they never thought they would be prepared to make. In that way, everyone can find himself or herself a villain or an unlikely hero. And of course, by the end of The Moon Is Down, someone who is originally worried about whether the hair in his ears is trimmed properly is finding himself being the sacrificial hero of the play. And so a discovery, perhaps, of one's place in the world, but a willingness to step up and embrace a choice when it comes. This seems very common to me in a lot of his work. And The Moon Is Down includes from so many different perspectives these discoveries of our heroism and our responsibility in the world.
Well, it's true because, you know, one of the things you hear about in The Moon Is Down is the talk of the people, not the leader. And you know, if you think of The Grapes of Wrath, I remember at the end of the movie when Henry Fonda is talking about, you know, it's the people. And for Steinbeck, regardless of what medium he's writing for, he's very interested in how individuals, you're right, hold up under pressure, assume a certain kind of heroism perhaps, or do really stupid things. But the people are individualized enough to sometimes claim a role that they didn't think that they were prepared for.
A couple questions about reception and expectation for the work. One, about the reception of the play. Do you have a feeling, and this is obviously counterfactual, but about how the play might have, reception of the play might have differed had it opened earlier or later at a different time? What about the timing of the opening of the play in mid-42?
That's an interesting question. I think that if the novel hadn't come first, the play might have been received differently.
Yeah.
I also think that if it had opened before Pearl Harbor, people would have been more open-minded about it. But yeah, at the time it did, because as we were trying to say earlier, that you know, early 1942 is really a moment of crisis in the war, where things aren't going well for the Allies, and to have a play like this that kind of is exploring some of the ideas about the enemy in saying more nuanced or sophisticated terms. The audience probably wasn't ready for that right then, but maybe if it had been earlier.
Yeah, I wonder if it had been like in 1944, because, you know, in popular culture more generally, by 1944, the momentum was with the Allies. And so things were changing a little bit. And in a lot of plays, say by late 1944, you could already see the movement towards thinking about the post-war world. And so maybe if The Moon Is Down had come then, the reception might have been different. But it was a hard time to portray our enemies as very human.
Well, indeed, and any of these, we can imagine all sorts of different courses that might have taken place.
Oh yeah,
the vicissitudes of play reception. I'll ask if anyone else would like to forward a question, or our colleague Amanda, who is following the YouTube chat, if there are any new questions. I know you said that some of the questions there we've already addressed. Anything else we want to bring in? Well, I want to give credit, and you can still ask even as I'm doing this. I just want to give an acknowledgement to this marvelous book, which I think our audience should know about. Published in 2021, it's University of Kentucky Press. Am I correct about that?
it's
Audience, I encourage you to get your copy. It's been so inspiring to me. There are a number of plays in it I hope that we will do again, but your assessment of them, Bob and Sally, and the perspective and context in which you place them is just delightful, witty, and illuminating, and just very, very exciting as we think about our comparatively recent cultural history. And I hope it will give Metropolitan new
thank you.
plays to look at in the future.
It was, it was interesting to write because in 2005, 6, we had written a book about American films during World War II. And one of the things that came out of that was, why was theater different? And so that kind of sparked our ideas about this. And one of the things to think about too, when you're thinking about theater during the war more broadly, is fewer people went to see plays, but plays during the war had a lot more cultural capital. Many of these plays, including The Moon is Down, went on the road. Some of them were made into films. And a lot of them were reviewed in, say, weekly or monthly popular publications. So there were different kinds of resonances for plays than there were for movies. But when you take popular culture as a whole, you can kind of see some really interesting patterns being laid out.
Mm-hmm.
You all surely do, and so I will. Oops, sorry. I'm going to say thank you again for the book, for the inspiration, and for this this really, really informative talk. I do hope that obviously you'll join us again, be rejoining us in New York as we open up the live theaters once more.
We hope so too.
Well, and for now, thank you. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to now just give the audience the link to watch the video of The Moon is Down. If you are interested in seeing all that we've been talking about, a play that with disturbing resonances, but truly inspirational and touching, as only Steinbeck ever managed to be. Playing through tomorrow night, midnight, Sunday, April 24th. Of course, that's midnight Eastern time, and then it is gone for forever after. And I will also note and remind you that Moon is Down is being presented as a fundraiser for Direct Relief. You can find out more about their work, and particularly their work in Ukraine, by looking at this link. Go to directrelief.org if you want to be focused on the Ukraine crisis, then directrelief.org, emergency Ukraine crisis. That's us from Metropolitan, Bob and Sally. Thank you yet again. And I will say, audience, thanks for being with us. We look forward to seeing you many times in the future, if online, if in person, however we can. Until that time, do stay well, stay safe, and love one another.